Good morning, Casey. How are you doing today?
Morning, Errol. I'm sure you hear this all the time, but what a cool name.
That name was actually created in Lewistown, Montana. My wife was looking for a character in a book that she was writing, and I thought, okay, when I go back to Billings in radio, then I'll take that name Arrow with me, and so I've carried it with me since then.
Very good. Didn't realize there was a Montana connection. My brother's out in Big Sky. He's been out there.
Really? Oh my God, that's gorgeous country out there.
Yeah, he went to University of Montana and then ended up staying. And he's been there for almost 20 years at this point.
Oh, those are real mountains out there. I mean, you can sit there at the bottom of those things and say, I ain't going up to the top of that thing. That's too high for me.
Yeah, it's always a treat visiting, flying out from New York and seeing how the other half lives out there.
Yeah. Hey, congratulations on this brand new book. And it comes out at such an incredible time because inside my heart, I wanted to say, billions of dollars are spent on elections every single election year. But these lobbyists don't have to run for office. They just do what they do. They sell spots off the leopard.
Well, that's exactly right. And thank you so much for the kind words. I mean, these lobbyists are, the foreign lobbyists that I write about, right? This industry is now making billions of dollars. So they're bringing in billions themselves, but of course they're not the ones running for office. What they're doing is opening the doors to foreign regimes, to those American officials, to those members of Congress, and to the White House itself. Again, all on behalf of the world's worst dictatorships, the Russias, the Chinas, the Irans, the Venezuelas of the world, and doing it out of sight, doing it for most Americans out of mind, and doing it in ways that affect American policy and, of course, all of us at the end of the day, whether it's things like economic aid or military aid or even things that are more specific to certain countries. But they are helping keep the world's worst dictators in power and helping shift and change American policy to do so.
My father used to tell me as a child, he said that, he says, we don't own this country. We never will. And he said, and he explained to me as a very young kid that you need to keep your eyes open and watch what these other countries are doing. And man, this book, it puts him, in that place of he was right.
Yeah, he absolutely was. I think this has been one of the more fascinating elements of writing this book because, again, it's a book about the foreign lobbying industry, what it is, what impact it has on the rest of us. Of course, there are a couple main characters and there's some narrative to the book. But one of the most fascinating elements of this is that this industry, it didn't come out of nowhere. It didn't just show up one day a couple years ago. You can go back decades, in some cases even centuries, to look at how foreign regimes, foreign governments are trying to affect American elections, American policy, right? It wasn't just the Russians in 2016. You can go back decades and centuries to look at other countries doing the same thing. And, you can look at the foreign lobbying industry in and of itself, right? These American lobbyists, those who work at PR firms and law firms, now increasingly places like think tanks and universities, and especially dozens and dozens of former members of Congress themselves, they have built out this entire industry that also goes back decades. One of the characters I write about in the book is this guy named Ivy Lee, yes, who is still considered the father of the public relations industry. But what a lot of folks don't remember, don't realize, don't know, is that he also lobbied directly on behalf of Mussolini in Rome, on behalf of the Soviets in Moscow, and then most notoriously on behalf of Hitler and the Nazis in Germany. And this was back in the 1920s and in the 1930s. So, yeah, it has this far longer lineage than I think a lot of folks are aware of.
But you know what? I was fascinated to read about Ivy Lee because I didn't know. And it's like now I've got a piece of history, and it helps me really go back and start looking at the entire puzzle pieces here.
Yeah. Look, it was fascinating for me as well, really kind of digging through his archives, digging through some of the material at the time. And of course, looking at what he was doing then for those regimes in Rome or in Berlin, but also what these lobbyists are doing in modern day, doing for, again, places like Moscow, places like Beijing, again, dictators and autocrats around the world. And what's funny is that the playbooks are actually they're pretty similar, yeah, right? It is on the one hand, accessing the American policymakers, having conversations with members of Congress or those in the White House themselves, or going to the media, going to American journalists and talking up how wonderful these regimes actually are. The phrase that we use is laundering their reputations, right? Whitewashing the reputations of these regimes, and that's what was happening in the 1920s and the 1930s, and that's what's happening now right here in the 2020s as well.
I'm shocked this hasn't been turned into some sort of board game because this really does sound like a game of chess.
Well, that's not a bad idea. I was going to say, one of my editors, she asked me, she wanted to make sure I'm not writing the playbook for how these lobbyists can actually go about their day-to-day business, whether it's laundering the reputations or, as I've written about previously, laundering the money itself. And I said, look, they don't need my help for a playbook. These networks and these systems are wide open for them, and unfortunately, they know exactly what they're doing.
So did you say laundering money? Because, I mean, that seems to be the big talk on the retail front. We have to really keep our eyes open for people who are potentially laundering their money.
Yeah, absolutely. That was the subject of my first book, which came out a few years ago, called American Kleptocracy. These books are very much kind of complements of one another. The new one, Foreign Agents, which is out on Tuesday, August 27th, that looks at the foreign lobbying industry, how these lobbyists help keep these regimes in power. That first book was about how these regimes use the American economy to launder their money, not just the traditional kind of offshore havens of Panama or the Caribbean or places in the Mediterranean, South Pacific, but how they use places in the United States, even places folks don't think of, like Delaware or like Wyoming or Nevada, to set up the shell companies, use anonymous real estate purchases, use anonymous investments, so on and so forth, because these are really two sides of the same coin. The more they can use these lobbyists to remain in power, the more they can then use that power to steal money from the populations, from the health budget, education budget, whatever it is, and launder that money, especially in places like the United States of America. So if you pull back, it's really kind of one big sordid system of remaining in power as long as these regimes can, so they can loot and launder as much money as they possibly can.
So those gold bricks that Bob Menendez has, is that a form of laundering?
Well, that's a great question. I'm very fortunate that revelation came out right as I was finishing the book. So there's a little bit in the book about Bob Menendez. Unfortunately, not his recent conviction, the very first member of Congress in American history convicted of being a foreign agent, being a foreign lobbyist. Look, I don't know what happened to those gold bars that he was accepting as part of this lobbying network, this secret lobbying network that he was involved in, working for the government in Egypt. But I do know that, if you're involved in a lobbying or a laundering network, it's probably not a good idea to Google how much a gold bar is worth, especially if prosecutors are going to find out about it.
When it comes to these national leaders, do they know that they're meeting up with lobbyists? Because it always makes me wonder, did these lobbyists meet with them before they went public and did that, that little question and answer period with the press?
That's also a great question, Errol. It kind of depends on the regime itself, depends on the dictator. Like, I don't think Vladimir Putin is having sit-down meetings with any American lobbyists. But again, it doesn't have to be just Putin. It can be regimes in places like Saudi Arabia, regimes in places like, that we don't think of necessarily, like Azerbaijan or like Rwanda, which are also American partners in those regions who absolutely have sit-down meetings with American lobbyists. I mean, again, these are ruthless, bloody dictators that are looking to these American lobbying firms, law firms, PR shops, and increasingly, unfortunately, members of Congress once they've left office to do their bidding. And they know the doors are wide open, and there's going to be no cost or very little cost, even if they eventually are found out.
So when you write a book like this and you're uncovering the truth about being a lobbyist, does it kind of scare you? Do you have to look over your shoulder?
I feel extremely fortunate for 1,000 reasons to be an American journalist, an American writer, where I have all kinds of protections and every confidence that I can go about my day job in safety and security. So in that sense, no, I'm not looking over my shoulder. But, it's the folks in the places like Azerbaijan or Rwanda or Russia or Saudi Arabia that are actually living and trying to work and operate under these regimes. I mean, those are the people that are really putting themselves on the line. Those are the folks on the front lines of all of this fight. And it's those folks that deserve the support of the American government or the American populace or whomever, rather than those regimes that are targeting those on the ground.
So when it comes to creating peace in other countries, are we throwing the lobbyists in that direction to kind of get in through the doors?
Well, look, again, it all varies on the country, so on and so forth. But certainly, as I argue in the book itself, this foreign lobbying industry is now such a malign force, such a destabilizing force that is really, at the end of the day, and maybe one of the ironic twists, working against American interests for peace, for stability, for democracy around the world. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be those democratic regimes that are the American partners, that are the stabilizing forces. It's not going to be the dictatorships in places like Moscow, because we see how that turns out in places like Ukraine and elsewhere.
One of the things you put focus on inside your book, Foreign Agents, is the fact that there's the word right there, fact. You kind of refocus our attention on fact. And I don't always believe in fact anymore, because can you trust fact?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think there is, again, in recent years, we have seen authoritarian figures or dictatorships flip facts around, turn facts on their heads. I think for me, at the end of the day, putting this book together, and it's there's hundreds of footnotes. There's something like 800 footnotes I ended up putting in there. It took a long time getting all those in. But I would like to think that, if nothing else, that speaks for itself, because it is the original documentation. It is the federal filings and the revelations from other journalists and elsewhere that really helped me put this story together about what these foreign lobbyists are doing, who they're doing it for, how much money they are making, and of course what effect they're having on us at the end of the day. Because in a certain sense, the numbers themselves don't lie, and the numbers point to an industry that is worth billions of dollars and working at the behest of all the worst regimes around the planet. In a very creative way, you're kind of like removing the curtain so we can see the wizard behind that curtain, because I didn't know what a master repairer was, or even if this position even worked. I mean, it's like, this is such a cool thing. Someone has to go in there and repair the path. It is. Again, I feel very fortunate to have been, the person who wrote this book. It was kind of a confluence of things for why this book ended up coming out now. But again, the industry itself, it has been around for decades. And so in a certain sense, I'm surprised, maybe disappointed, whatever it might be, that folks weren't paying more attention to it beforehand. But I also kind of understand why that wasn't the case necessarily, because, up until very recently, we hadn't seen scandal after scandal of either a former or current presidents opening their doors to foreign lobbyists, sometimes directly members of their family, or of course figures like Bob Menendez, one of the highest rankings members of the Senate, convicted, acting as a foreign agent. We just never seen anything like that in American history. So in a certain way, the timing for this book couldn't be better, but I do kind of wish that wasn't the case. Well, let's talk about Paul Manafort then. I mean, we're talking about a man whose name is all over those headlines. Yeah, Manafort, for folks who might remember, he was Donald Trump's 2016 campaign manager. And but what a lot of folks I think maybe have forgotten at this point is he didn't just kind of emerge out of nowhere. Right. He goes all the way back to the 1970s, 1980s, creating the domestic lobbying industry in the United States of America in and of itself, and then takes his talents abroad and really kind of creates or recreates the foreign lobbying industry as it currently is. And he works with dictators in Nigeria, in Somalia, in Democratic Republic of Congo, in Philippines, over and over. And again, maybe most notoriously, he ends up in Ukraine working for a range of pro-Russian figures. That blows up in his face with the Ukrainian Revolution 10 years ago. Then he kind of tucks tail, comes back to the United States, and then he gets a call from Donald Trump, who's looking for a campaign manager. And the rest, they say, is history. But the reason that I focus so much on Manafort in the book itself is not just because of his history and his role in creating this industry, but because when it all ended up blowing up in his face in the late 2010s, he was investigated, he ended up jailed. That is really when a lot of Americans realized, oh, these foreign lobbyists aren't some kind of just, backroom background matter that we don't have to pay attention to. They're a very real threat to American democracy writ large. So these lobbyists, do they go into it blindly? In other words, do they know that they're a lobbyist? Because I know a lot of radio salespeople that are very good at convincing others. They, I think, at the end of the day, realize what they are doing. They know who they are doing it for. I don't think I have any case studies in there of folks who don't know who they are working for, what regimes they are working for at the end of the day. But what certainly I have seen in my own life, in my own experiences, and certainly what I report on in the book itself, is that these lobbyists don't always disclose to the legislators or to the other Americans that they are actually lobbying, that these people are lobbyists at the end of the day. The most I guess memorable case study for this was when the country of Azerbaijan, which is it's a decades-long dictatorship, it ended up flying a dozen members of Congress over to Azerbaijan. It was the biggest congressional junket that the region had ever seen. And, all the members of Congress, they're wined and dined. They have these lavish dinners. They have crystal tea sets, $1,000 rugs, so on. This whole litany of gifts they receive, including, as memory serves, a DVD of how great the country's dictator actually is. But what they didn't realize at the time is that the group that was funding it, they thought it was just some nonprofit trying to improve relations between the U.S. and Azerbaijan. They didn't realize that nonprofit was basically fake. And it was the government in Azerbaijan that was secretly funding their trip over there, paying for absolutely everything. And of course, at the end of the day, trying to get these members of Congress on the side of these of the regime in Azerbaijan. We only know about this because of investigations at that came out afterward. But the funny little coda to that story, and again, these legislators didn't know they were working with these lobbyists. They didn't realize it was a state-funded trip. what was funny about that story, though, Arrow, is that I was actually, as a journalist on my own, I was invited on that trip by one lobbyist who said, we would love to fly you over. We'll put you up. It's going to be great. You're going to love it. The only thing we ask is you just don't write anything negative about our country, about our country. And I said, look, thanks, but no thanks. And, I guess I regret not going because it sounds like it was the trip of a lifetime. But, hey, it made for good fodder for a book.
Oh, my God. I've been in those situations, not in other countries, but where people say, hey, I know you like speaking the truth, but this time around, we kind of need you to bend our direction. And it's like, what's going on here? And I mean, and all of a sudden, when you start feeling that in your heart, what's your reaction?
Yeah. Look, everyone has to make their own decision, at the end of the day in those situations themselves. I think, Errol, you made a point just now that it wasn't necessarily foreign governments or foreign regimes that are coming to you and asking you to make that decision on your own. And I think one of the clear revelations on my end is that, again, this foreign lobbying industry, it didn't just emerge out of nowhere, and it didn't even really emerge because foreign dictators are coming to Americans and saying, we would like to set up a lobbying firm or set up a PR firm or a law firm and do our bidding. This industry really grew out of the domestic context, the domestic lobbying industry itself. And it's folks like Paul Manafort and others in his orbit who realized, okay, we've succeeded in the United States of America. And this is, late 20th century, 1980s, 1990s. They realized they've succeeded in America, but oh my goodness, there are so many other potential clients abroad. And oh, by the way, there are these foreign governments who have bottomless mounds of money that they are willing to throw at these lobbyists, which is, again, how it ended up growing into this multi-billion-dollar industry now that, everyone, it seems like, has taken full advantage of.
So how do you tell the difference between a lobbyist and somebody who's spreading propaganda?
Well, that's a great question. Increasingly, we have seen the line between that blurred. One of the key questions for me on my end writing this book, but also for some of those that are, prosecuting these cases or, other lawyers that are focused on this, is that at the end of the day, lobbying in the United States of America, that's a constitutionally protected right. It's right there in the First Amendment, which, again, I think a lot of folks overlook, right there next to freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. You have the freedom to petition the government for redress of grievances, which is just kind of an old-timey way now of saying going to your legislator, going to lawmakers, and lobbying on behalf of whatever the cause might be, right? Whether that's environmental reform or infrastructure investment or healthcare reform, all these domestic considerations. You, me, other Americans, we have the constitutional protections to do this. We can do this perfectly freely and legally. So the question then becomes, okay, where do you draw the line about the illegality of this? Where does it become a crime for foreign lobbyists, those who are not advocating for, again, American domestic reforms, but are advocating for how wonderful Putin is or how wonderful Xi Jinping is or, whatever it might be? Where is the crime? And so it's kind of an ever-evolving space, but one of the crux of the issues right here is, okay, we can't ban lobbying, but we can provide transparency. We can require these lobbyists to disclose what they are doing, who they're doing it for, and how much money they're making at the end of the day, which is what has happened, which is why folks can go on things like the Department of Justice website and look through all of these filings. And again, this is one thing I recommend folks and listeners, and frankly, anyone with a computer do, is just Google, Department of Justice Foreign Agents Registration Act database. That's the main database. It has all the filings right there. Folks can go take a look at what these firms are doing, what these regimes are doing, and maybe even what their local lawmakers are doing as well. What doors are actually being opened.
See, what I love about this book is it creates conversation in the way that Johnny Joe Blow average does not know anything about this. But when they pick up your book and they get into it, now they're going to take it to their friends and they're going to say, did you know? No, I did not. Oh, you're not going to believe this.
Well, that's certainly the hope, Aaron. I again, because who goes throughout their day thinking about the foreign lobbying industry? God knows how I ended up in this space. But of course, that's why I wrote this book in the first place, because it is these American firms that are lobbying American legislators, all on behalf of not other Americans, not other American causes, but again, the world's worst dictators or oligarchs, in some cases outright anti-American regimes that are, destabilizing their countries, that are looting their populations, that are invading their neighbors, that are creating headaches or national security crises or whatever it might be for the rest of us. And oh, by the way, many of these lobbyists are also advocating for things like military aid and economic aid. So that's the American taxpayer at the end of the day that's paying for this, that these lobbyists are succeeding at. And look, I'm I'm hoping this is the first book of many to come for other folks, other researchers, other journalists to write on the topic. Because, at the end of the day, it's not going anywhere, and we're going to have to deal with it one way or the other.
Wow. Casey, you got to come back to this show anytime in the future. That door is always going to be open for you.
Thanks so much, Arrow.
Well, you be brilliant today, okay?
Thanks, Arrow. I appreciate it. That was great.